The story you are about to hear is not just about a girl, but about a desk. A desk pushed to the back of a classroom, meant to hold silence, meant to hold shame. In the deep south of the 1960s, a 15-year-old black girl named Ruby Ellis walked into a world that did not want her there. A world of white uniforms and sharpened stares, where every laugh, every whisper, carried the weight of exclusion. They forced her to the last desk, the place no one wanted to sit. And from that exile they expected her to vanish. But Ruby did not vanish. She endured the jeers in the hallways, the sabotage of her lessons, the cruel silence of teachers who looked past her. She endured parents who protested at the school gates and children who mirrored their hatred with sharpened tongues. Night after night, she bent over books by a flickering lamp, carrying not only her own hope, but the burden of those yet to come. This is the story of humiliation turned into defiance, of quiet strength forged into triumph. A story of a girl who began in the shadows of a classroom and ended in the light of a stage, her name spoken with disbelief yet etched into history. Stay with us as we unfold this 90-minute journey, The Last Desk. And if these stories of resilience, struggle, and triumph move you, remember to subscribe to Blackness Hour, where history's buried voices rise and speak again. The bus rolled through the quiet southern streets, its brakes groaning like a weary giant carrying the weight of history itself. Inside, Ruby Ellis sat near the window, her small hands clutched around a worn leather notebook. The morning sun caught the edges of her braids, turning them to strands of bronze as she stared outside, trying to calm the storm building in her chest. It was 1965, and though the Supreme Court had declared segregation illegal more than a decade earlier, the South was not eager to yield its grip. The battlefields of integration had shifted from lunch counters and buses to the very heart of white America's pride, its schools. And Ruby, just 15 years old, had been chosen, or perhaps condemned, to walk into that battlefield. Her mother's words echoed in her ears. "Baby, your desk might be at the back of the room, but your mind will always be in the front. Don't let them move you." Ruby had nodded bravely at the breakfast table, though her stomach twisted into knots. As the bus neared the school, Ruby caught sight of the building, tall, white columns, manicured lawns, the architecture of old Southern pride. The very bricks seemed to whisper with a history that had excluded her kind for centuries. Children, pale-faced and pressed into spotless uniforms, streamed through its iron gates, laughing, confident, belonging. Ruby tightened her grip on her notebook. She belonged too, though the world insisted otherwise. When the bus hissed to a stop, her feet felt heavier than her body. She descended slowly, the soles of her shoes touching the ground like she was stepping into another world, a world where every eye was waiting to measure, judge, dismiss. The crowd at the gate quieted. Conversations faltered, laughter thinned. Parents who had brought their children turned to stare, lips tightening, eyes narrowing. Ruby walked on, her spine stiff though her pulse hammered. She could feel the heat of their stares burning into her skin like firebrands. Inside, the hallways smelled of polish and chalk dust. Trophy cases gleamed with golden achievements, none of them hers, none of them belonging to anyone who looked like her. Students parted reluctantly as she passed, not out of respect, but as though she carried something contagious. Whispers fluttered behind her, sharp, cutting. The principal, Mr. Whitaker, waited at the front office. His handshake was stiff, his smile forced. "Welcome, Ruby," he said, his voice brittle as glass. "We trust you'll find your place here." The pause on place was heavy with meaning. Her place. Everyone already knew where that was supposed to be. When she entered her first classroom, the chatter stopped. The teacher, Mrs. Perkins, froze for a moment before pointing vaguely to the back. You may take that desk," she said, gesturing to the last seat by the window. The last desk. The one no one wanted. The one that would become her prison and her proving ground. Ruby walked past rows of desks, past the stares and sneers, her heart pounding in her ears. She set her notebook down gently, refusing to let the tremor in her hands show. From the back, the blackboard looked far away, like knowledge itself had been placed at a distance from her. Yet she leaned forward, eyes locked, determined to bridge that gap with her mind if not her body. But even as she steadied herself, she knew this was not just the first day of school. This was the first day of war. The lessons began, but they were not lessons for Ruby. They were performances, teachers speaking to everyone except her, chalk scratching across the board as if she weren't there. When she raised her hand, Mrs. Perkins' eyes slid past her like glass, calling on a white student instead. When she wrote in her notebook, a boy 2 rows ahead leaned back just far enough to whisper, "You don't belong here." His friends snickered. At lunch, she carried her tray into the cafeteria. Tables were full of chatter and cliques, but as Ruby walked past, chairs shifted, backs turned. She finally found an empty spot in the corner, sitting alone with her sandwich as if she were an intruder at her own table. Every bite felt like gravel in her mouth. That night at home, she didn't tell her mother about the silences, the whispers, the loneliness. She only said, "It was hard, but I managed." Her mother kissed her forehead, whispering, "Every battle starts with one step, baby." The next day was worse. A folded note appeared on her desk, "Go back where you belong." When she opened her locker, chalk dust spilled out, covering her books, her hands, her dress. The laughter in the hallway was loud and cruel. Teachers pretended not to notice. Yet Ruby wrote. Every night, under the yellow glow of her bedroom lamp, she wrote in her notebook, lessons she taught herself, words her teachers denied her, dreams bigger than the last desk. She wrote like her survival depended on it, because it did. And so, as the days turned into weeks, the war of silence pressed on. Ruby did not fight with fists or shouts. She fought with the quiet fire of a mind that refused to be erased. Even as she sat in the last desk, history was moving her to the front row of something much larger than a classroom. By the second week, Ruby had learned the rhythm of hostility. The silence in the classroom was no longer empty, it pulsed, heavy and deliberate, pressing her down like an unseen weight. Each morning, as she approached the tall white columns of the school, she could feel the unspoken challenge in the air. How much more can you take before you break? The whispers turned to words, and the words became daggers. As she passed down the hallway, boys leaned against lockers with smirks carved into their faces. "Hey, last desk!" One sneered, his voice echoing against the tiled walls. Another added, "Careful, don't touch her, you might catch something." Laughter erupted like a cruel chorus, filling the air. Ruby lowered her gaze but quickened her step, clutching her books to her chest as if they were armor. She had told herself she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. But sometimes, when the hall grew too long, when the echoes grew too sharp, her throat ached with the weight of unshed tears. The teachers were no refuge. Mrs. Perkins, who had once smiled stiffly at her arrival, now treated her as though she were invisible. When Ruby raised her hand, it remained suspended in the air, unanswered, until the weight of neglect forced it down. Mr. Crawley, the history teacher, was worse. "Now, class," he said one afternoon, pacing before the blackboard. "Some folks think they can change centuries of order overnight." His eyes flicked to Ruby like a dagger before he continued. "But history has a way of correcting mistakes." The room tittered with laughter, the message sharp and unmistakable. At lunch, humiliation deepened. One day, Ruby slid her tray onto the corner table where she always sat alone, but before she could lower herself into the chair, a girl spilled a carton of milk across it. "Oops," the girl smirked. "Guess there's no place for you here." The group at the table erupted in laughter as Ruby stood frozen, milk dripping onto the floor, her tray trembling in her hands. She walked to another corner, but by the time she sat down, her appetite was gone. That night in her bedroom, Ruby wrote in her notebook again. But the words were jagged, uneven, filled with anger she couldn't release anywhere else. "They don't want me here. They'll never want me here. But if I leave, they win." The page blurred as tears finally fell, smudging her ink. She pressed her face into her hands, letting the sobs shake through her until she felt hollow. Her mother found her there, sitting on the edge of the bed. She didn't scold her for crying. Instead, she lifted Ruby's chin with gentle hands. Baby, every time they push you down, you stand taller. Not because they deserve it, but because you do. Don't let their hate shrink you. Ruby nodded, but inside she wondered how much longer she could endure being the target of an entire school. The following morning, the hostility became performance. As Ruby walked into class, she noticed the stifled grins. Something was waiting for her. She approached her desk, the last one by the window, only to find it covered in chalk graffiti. Scrawled across the wood in jagged letters were the words, "An asterisk 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 go home." Asterisk. Her breath caught in her chest. For a moment, the world spun. The teacher saw it, hesitated, then turned away, pretending to shuffle papers. Ruby's classmates roared with laughter, their voices echoing in her ears. She placed her books down anyway, refusing to retreat. She sat in silence, her hands trembling in her lap as the letters burned into her vision. That night, Ruby's father, who worked long shifts at the mill, sat with her at the kitchen table. He didn't speak right away, just studied her face, her swollen eyes. Finally, he said, "Ruby, you're carrying a weight that should never be on your shoulders. But sometimes, history picks the wrong shoulders and calls them the right ones. You understand?" Ruby swallowed hard and nodded. But the cruelty did not stop. In gym class, she was always the last chosen for teams. In science, her lab partner deliberately knocked over beakers when she tried to work. In English, papers went missing from her desk, torn to shreds in the trash. It was a campaign not of fists but of constant cuts, each one designed to bleed her spirit dry. One afternoon, as Ruby walked home, a group of students followed behind, tossing insults like stones. "Last desk," they jeered. "Why don't you crawl under it and stay there?" Ruby kept walking, her steps quick and tight, but inside her chest, something was hardening. That night, she stared at her notebook again. But instead of recording her pain, she wrote the words, "I will not break. I will not break." She repeated the sentence over and over until it filled the page, until the ink pressed so deep into the paper it nearly tore through. Humiliation had scarred her, but within the scars, something was beginning to form. A seed of defiance. A whisper of strength. Ruby did not yet know it, but the last desk would not be her prison forever. One day, it would be the proof of her endurance. Winter came, and with it, the cold seemed to seep not only through the cracks of the old school's windows but into Ruby's bones. The days stretched long, measured not by the lessons she learned, but by the battles she endured in silence. Her footsteps through the halls had become their own rhythm. Head held high, eyes forward, books clutched to her chest. Every whisper behind her, every laugh that rose when she entered a room, was another reminder of her isolation. And yet, Ruby discovered something within that isolation, a discipline, a rhythm of survival. She woke before dawn, studying at the kitchen table while her mother brewed coffee. At school, she copied every word on the blackboard, even when teachers ignored her raised hand. At night, she filled page after page of her notebook, rewriting lessons until the ink blurred. Knowledge became her rebellion. Every formula memorized, every date recalled, was another weapon in the quiet war she fought. But silence was not just survival. It was also its own humiliation. In group projects, Ruby's suggestions were drowned out or mocked. In the cafeteria, she ate alone every single day. At assemblies, she sat at the far end of the row, unseen, unacknowledged. To the school, she was not Ruby Ellis, a bright young girl with fire in her mind. She was the last desk, a shadow, a test of patience and flesh. And yet, the silence carried strange power. When Mrs. Perkins paused mid-lecture, Ruby answered the question in her mind before anyone else. When Mr. Crawley droned about history, Ruby remembered dates and contexts that none of her peers could hold onto. In silence, her knowledge sharpened. In isolation, her resilience grew roots. There were moments, however, when the weight pressed too heavily. One afternoon, she overheard two mothers in the hallway as they collected their children. "Why they let her in here, I'll never understand," one hissed. "She'll drag the whole school down." The words carved deep into Ruby's chest. She smiled politely as she passed, but once outside, her steps faltered. That night, at the dinner table, her mother reached across and squeezed her hand. You hear them because they're loud. But you don't hear the quiet ones, the ones who see you and know what you're doing. Baby, history is watching. Even when the people in front of you aren't. Ruby nodded, though tears blurred her food on the plate. History was watching. But history, she thought, felt like such a cold companion when the present was so merciless. As weeks turned into months, the last desk became both her burden and her sanctuary. The other students left her untouched corner alone now, not out of respect but because the cruelty had grown stale. Ruby claimed the desk as her fortress. From it, she observed, listened, studied, and endured. She learned to recognize the subtleties in people's faces, the flicker of doubt in a teacher's eyes, the smirk in a classmate's grin, the tight line of parents' mouths when she walked by. She began to see that their hatred was not born from strength, but from fear. Fear of what it would mean if she succeeded. Fear of what it would mean if she proved them wrong. There was one moment that stayed with her, one that cracked the silence in an unexpected way. During a math lesson, Mrs. Perkins asked a complex problem no student could answer. The room fell into an uneasy quiet. Ruby, without lifting her hand, whispered the solution under her breath. The boy in front of her turned, stunned, and repeated her answer aloud. Mrs. Perkins nodded. Correct. The boy took the credit, and the class moved on, but Ruby felt a strange flicker inside her chest. They don't have to say my name. I know I was right. It was a small, invisible victory, but a victory nonetheless. On Sundays, Ruby's family sat in the front pew of their small church. The pastor often spoke about Daniel in the lion's den, about endurance in the face of trials. Ruby sat with her notebook tucked beside her Bible, scribbling not just the verses, but reflections of her own. Maybe I am Daniel. Maybe this school is the den. The choir sang, their voices rising like armor, and for a brief moment, she believed it. One evening, as she closed her notebook, Ruby stared at the words she had written over and over on the first page. I will not break. She touched the sentence with her fingertips, as though sealing it into her very skin. The world around her demanded her silence, demanded her humiliation, demanded her erasure. But her endurance, her quiet, stubborn endurance, was becoming something unshakable. The first act of her battle was not victory, not yet. It was survival. And survival, Ruby began to realize, was its own form of defiance. Even in the last desk, she was still standing. By spring, the cruelty had grown bold. What began as whispers in the hallways and smirks in the classroom evolved into coordinated acts designed to remind Ruby Ellis of her place. The students had turned her existence into a spectacle, a theater of humiliation. One morning, as Ruby entered the classroom, she found her chair missing. The desk stood bare, an island without a seat. Her classmates burst into laughter, some clapping mockingly. She stood frozen, her books pressed to her chest, her eyes darting to the teacher. Mr. Crawley, standing at the front, sighed as though inconvenienced. Find another chair, he said, without so much as a glance at her. Ruby dragged a chair from the corner of the room, the screech of wood against tile echoing louder than their laughter. She sat, cheeks burning, but she refused to cry. At recess, the playground became another battlefield. A group of boys blocked her path, tossing a rubber ball between them. "Wanna play last desk?" one sneered. When she didn't answer, they hurled the ball at her chest, hard enough to knock the wind out of her. Ruby staggered back but caught her breath before it became a sob. The boys jeered and moved on, leaving her clutching her notebook, her fingers trembling. At night, Ruby sat at her desk at home, her lamp casting a warm glow over her notebooks. She poured herself into equations, essays, dates, and diagrams. The page was the only place she could control the outcome, where no one could erase her answers or mock her voice. Sometimes she whispered the words aloud as though teaching an invisible class, her own reflection in the window her only audience. "The answer," she said softly to herself, "is that I belong here." But the weight was building, and each new day seemed to press harder on her chest. The sabotage reached its cruelest when exams approached. Ruby's textbooks disappeared from her desk one morning, leaving only an empty space where her lifelines had been. She searched frantically, but the smirks of her classmates told her everything. That night, she found the torn remains of her books in the trash bin behind the school, pages ripped and scattered like confetti. Her heart sank, but she refused to surrender. She borrowed library copies, copying notes, furiously by hand, staying awake until her candle sputtered out. Her mother would find her slumped over the table, pencil still in hand, lips moving with unfinished words. Her father, quietly, began to buy her second-hand books from thrift shops, placing them by her bed without a word. The weight of their sacrifice burned in Ruby's chest, but it also fed her resolve. The insults at school became sharper as exams neared. "No way she's gonna pass," one boy said loudly as she walked by. "Bet she can't even spell her own name." Ruby tightened her grip on her books, refusing to flinch. Another day, a girl scribbled across her locker with chalk, "You'll never be one of us." Ruby wiped it off with her sleeve, leaving a faint white smear across her dress. The cruelty extended beyond her peers. One afternoon, during a history review session, Mr. Crawley posed a question no one could answer. Ruby, quietly, whispered the correct date under her breath. A boy near her repeated it loudly, earning praise. Ruby sat in silence, her teeth gritted, her knuckles white. The injustice burned, but inside something else sparked, a simmering fire she hadn't felt before. That night, she wrote in her notebook not just notes, but declarations. "I will outlast them. I will not just pass, I will rise. Their laughter will not be the end of me." The words filled page after page, her pen carving them into permanence. The tension in the school grew thick as the first exam loomed. Ruby could feel eyes on her everywhere she went, waiting for her to stumble, to confirm the story they had already written about her, that she was a failure, a mistake, a symbol of arrogance for daring to sit among them. One morning, as she walked into the classroom, she found a crude drawing pinned to her desk, a caricature of her, hunched and exaggerated, with the words "Last Desk Loser" scrawled above. The laughter that followed was deafening. Ruby picked up the drawing, folded it carefully, and placed it in her notebook. She would not give them the performance they wanted. She sat down, spine straight, her silence louder than their cruelty. But silence, though powerful, carried its cost. In the privacy of her room, she broke down, clutching the folded drawing until it tore in her hands. Her sobs shook through the walls, and her mother stood at the doorway, tears brimming in her own eyes, knowing she could not take the pain away. She only whispered, "One day, baby, they'll see. One day." Ruby lifted her chin, wiping her face, staring at her reflection in the window. "One day," she echoed. By now, even the walls of the school seemed to press against her, suffocating in their hostility. But beneath the layers of humiliation, Ruby's spirit was crystallizing into something harder than the cruelty thrown at her. Each insult, each stolen book, each jeer became fuel. She didn't know it yet, but the exams would not only test her knowledge, they would test the strength of the defiance she had been building in silence. And history, though quiet, was waiting. The days leading up to the midterm exam carried the heavy tension of an approaching storm. The entire school buzzed with anxiety, but for Ruby Ellis, the pressure felt like the weight of the world itself. Her performance was no longer just about grades. It was a referendum on her very right to exist within those walls. Whispers followed her everywhere. In the library, two girls leaned close over their open books. "She won't make it," one whispered. "She's just pretending." In the hallway, a boy muttered loudly enough for Ruby to hear, "When she fails, maybe they'll finally put her back where she belongs." The cruel certainty in their voices pressed against her ribs, suffocating. One afternoon, Ruby lingered in the empty classroom, waiting for her teacher to leave so she could collect scraps of notes from the chalkboard before they were erased. As she copied down the last sentence, Mr. Crawley finally turned to her. His eyes lingered on her for a moment, sharp, piercing. "You'll need more than late-night scribbling to keep up, Ellis." His tone was not advice but dismissal, an assurance that she was destined to fall behind. Ruby met his gaze, her throat tightening, and whispered softly, "I'll be ready." He didn't reply. At home, the strain was showing. Ruby's mother watched her from the kitchen table, shoulders hunched over, lips moving silently as she recited facts and equations to herself. Dark circles formed beneath her eyes. Her younger brother asked, "Why are they so mean to you?" Ruby paused, unable to answer. She reached across the table and squeezed his small hand. "Because I'm different. But different doesn't mean wrong." Her words trembled, but she forced the conviction into her tone for his sake, even as doubt gnawed at her from within. The nights grew longer, pages of notes piling like barricades around her. She whispered her lessons to the stillness of the house, as though willing the walls themselves to absorb the knowledge. Yet beneath the determination, fear coiled tighter. She was walking a rope stretched over a pit, and everyone around her was waiting for her to fall. The breaking point came not with one grand act of cruelty, but through 1,000 small cuts that bled Ruby's spirit thin. On the morning of the exam, Ruby arrived early, clutching her notebook as though it were a shield. She sat at her desk, hands trembling slightly, trying to steady her breath. Around her, classmates filed in, their laughter sharp, their glances pointed. One girl leaned toward another and whispered, "She's gonna crack today. Just watch." As the test papers were handed out, Ruby bent over hers, determination hardening her jaw. But midway through, a shadow fell over her desk. A boy behind her leaned forward and hissed, "Better get it right, last desk. Whole world's watching." The words slithered into her ears, breaking her concentration. Her pencil slipped, and for the first time, the numbers on the page blurred before her eyes. When the bell rang, Ruby turned in her paper, her chest tight, her mind whirling with doubt. She walked out of the classroom, the hallway stretching long and suffocating. At her locker, she found another cruel message scrawled in chalk: "Failure fits you best." She wiped it away with the sleeve of her dress, but this time her hands wouldn't stop shaking. By the time she reached home, Ruby collapsed onto her bed, clutching her pillow as sobs racked through her body. The dam she had built so carefully against her pain burst wide open. "Why do I even try?" she whispered into the sheets. "Why won't they let me be?" Her mother entered quietly, sitting on the edge of the bed, stroking Ruby's hair. She didn't speak at first, she simply let Ruby cry until her body grew still. Then, softly, she said, "Baby, the world will always try to break what it fears. But that breaking doesn't have to be your end. Sometimes breaking is the start of becoming stronger." Ruby listened, her heart aching, her chest raw. Yet her mother's words planted a seed she couldn't yet name. The following days were heavy with silence. Ruby carried herself through the halls like a ghost, her eyes downcast, her spirit dimmed. The laughter that followed her felt louder now, sharper, like knives thrown at her back. The teacher's indifference cut deeper, confirming what her peers shouted in their jeers, that she was invisible, unworthy, disposable. One evening, she sat at the dinner table, staring blankly at the untouched food before her. Her father watched her, worry shadowing his features. Finally, he pushed his plate aside and leaned forward. "Ruby," he said quietly, "you can't let them decide who you are. You've been fighting battles most folks can't even see. Don't let their hate make you forget your own strength." His voice was steady, but Ruby could see the glint of unshed tears in his eyes. Later that night, Ruby opened her notebook, staring at the sentences she had once written with such fire. "I will not break." She touched the words with trembling fingers, then pressed the pencil to the page. Slowly, deliberately, she added, "Even if I do break, I will rise again." The act of writing it, of admitting her fragility but also her resilience, brought a strange calm. She realized that breaking was not the same as surrendering. Breaking could be the forge where something unshakable was born. For the first time, Ruby allowed herself to imagine victory. Not the kind where her classmates cheered for her, or her teachers praised her, but a quieter triumph, one where she proved to herself that she was more than their cruelty. That her worth was not defined by their acceptance. She closed the notebook, whispered to herself, "They want me to fall. But I'll stand taller than they ever dreamed." And with that, The breaking point became not an end, but the first spark of transformation. The next morning, Ruby rose before dawn. The sky was still ink black, broken only by a pale sliver of moon hanging low on the horizon. She sat at her desk by the window, a candle flickering beside her notebooks. The house was silent, her family still asleep, but Ruby's heart beat with a strange urgency. Her mother's words still echoed, "Sometimes breaking is the start of becoming stronger." She thought about that sentence as she opened her notebook and read the words she had scrawled the night before, "Even if I do break, I will rise again." The letters, shaky and uneven, stared back at her. For the first time, she did not feel ashamed of their imperfection. Instead, she traced her finger over them, letting their meaning soak deep into her bones. She began to study, but something had shifted. The pressure was still there, heavy as always, but beneath it flowed a different current, a kind of quiet defiance. She was no longer studying simply to survive their cruelty, she was preparing to defy it. Each page of notes became not just knowledge, but armor. Every equation solved, every paragraph memorized, felt like another stone placed in the fortress she was building inside herself. By the time the morning light broke, Ruby closed her books and looked at her reflection in the window. Her hair was untidy, her eyes rimmed with fatigue, but there was something different in the way she held her chin. She whispered, "You will not bow, Ruby Ellis. Not to them." When she walked into the classroom later that morning, she carried herself differently. The students noticed. The same group of boys who jeered at her daily threw a wad of paper at her back as she sat down. Normally, she would have ignored it, cheeks burning. But this time, she picked up the paper, unfolded it, and placed it flat on her desk for all to see. It was another cruel caricature of her, lips exaggerated, hair scribbled wild. She smoothed it with her palm and set her pencil atop it. She didn't smile, didn't cry, didn't even look at them. But her silence was sharp, and for a brief second, the laughter faltered. Something inside her had turned. The days that followed revealed the spark growing stronger. When classmates whispered insults in the hallway, Ruby slowed her steps deliberately, refusing to shrink into the shadows. When a boy muttered, "You'll never pass," she turned her head and met his eyes, not with anger but with a calm steadiness that unsettled him. It was not defiance in words but in presence, a refusal to vanish. Her resilience became visible even to her teachers, though they rarely acknowledged it. During one math lesson, Mr. Crawley posed a problem to the class. The room buzzed with half-formed guesses and wrong answers. Ruby raised her hand, her voice steady as she solved the equation step by step. Mr. Crawley frowned, as though displeased, but he could not deny she was correct. For the first time, a hush fell over the room. Her classmates exchanged uneasy glances. She was not supposed to shine, not here, not in this space they had decided was not hers to claim. Outside of school, Ruby's world narrowed to long hours of study and moments of still reflection. One evening, as she sat by the fire with her parents, she confessed softly, "Sometimes I feel like I'm fighting a war all alone." Her father leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Ruby," he said, voice low but firm, "wars are never fought alone. You may feel alone in those halls, but every page you read, every answer you write, you carry us with you. Your mama's prayers, my sacrifices, even your brother's pride. Don't ever forget, your victory is ours too." Ruby felt tears sting her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She nodded, and for the first time, the burden felt a little lighter. The fight was hers, but the strength that carried her through it was shared. Her classmates, sensing her unbroken spirit, escalated their cruelty. One day, she opened her locker to find her notebooks drenched in ink, pages bleeding into unreadable stains. She stood there, the smell of ink heavy in the air, the laughter swelling behind her. For a moment, the sting of despair almost broke her. But instead, Ruby tore the ruined pages from the bindings, folded what little remained dry, and carried them to her desk. She would start again. She would not give them the victory they craved. Her resilience, though silent, had begun to shine like a faint light in the dark. The turning point came during an afternoon study session in the library. Ruby sat alone at a table, her books spread before her, when she noticed a younger black student hovering nearby. The girl, no more than 10, clutched a small stack of books and stared at Ruby with wide, uncertain eyes. Ruby offered a gentle smile and motioned to the chair beside her. The girl sat slowly, placing her books down. After a few moments of silence, she whispered, "They call me names too." Her voice cracked, heavy with the familiar shame Ruby knew too well. Ruby's chest tightened, but she reached across the table and touched the girl's hand lightly. "Then you and I," Ruby said softly, "will carry each other through." The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. That moment, simple as it was, shifted something deep within Ruby. She realized that her fight was not just her own survival, it was a beacon for others who came after her. The cruelty she endured was not only a battle against her but against the possibility of anyone like her daring to claim a seat in that school. From then on, Ruby's spark of defiance grew into quiet fire. She began to rise earlier, study harder, not only for herself but for the unseen faces who might one day walk the same halls. The laughter, the insults, the sabotage, they still cut, but they no longer defined her. Late at night, as she studied by candlelight, she whispered to herself, "They will not erase me. They will not erase us." And so, in the heart of her breaking, Ruby Ellis discovered the first flicker of her true power, the power to endure, to resist, and to inspire. The spring air carried a tension so thick it clung to the walls of the school. Exam season had arrived, and with it came the weight of expectation that Ruby Ellis would fail. It was not whispered anymore. It was spoken aloud, repeated like a prophecy. In the hallways, voices trailed behind her like shadows. "She's not ready. She's not smart enough. She doesn't belong here." Ruby felt every word, but she wore her silence like armor. Her mornings began before sunrise. She would rise while the house still slept, her lamp glowing dimly against the pale gray of dawn. The quiet was hers, the one sanctuary where no laughter pierced and no chalk scrawled insults across her desk. Her mother would sometimes find her hunched over the table, lips moving silently as she memorized passages, her pencil tapping against the page like a heartbeat. At school, she carried a stack of second-hand books so high it almost eclipsed her face. They were tattered, worn, and smelled of dust, but inside them Ruby found power. She filled notebook after notebook, writing until her fingers cramped, her ink-stained hands a badge of her persistence. The cruelty did not stop. One morning, she opened her desk to find a note waiting for her. "Don't even bother. You'll embarrass yourself." The handwriting was familiar, one of the older boys who had mocked her since the beginning. Ruby held the note for a long moment, then folded it neatly and slid it between the pages of her history book. She would not throw it away. No, she would keep it, a reminder, a challenge. When her hand trembled at the exam table, she would remember that note, and her resolve would stiffen. The school itself seemed to hum with tension. Students in crisp uniforms filled the library, whispering formulas, quizzing each other, the sound of frantic study echoing between tall wooden shelves. Ruby often sat alone in the corner, the isolation as heavy as the books stacked around her. She studied quietly, lips forming the answers she refused to stumble over. Though no one spoke to her, she noticed glances, sideways, sharp, testing. They wanted to see cracks. They wanted her collapse to be public. But Ruby, though weary, had learned the art of endurance. Her silence was no longer submission, it was defiance. Every word memorized was a strike against the prophecy written for her. Every page she filled was a weapon forged in secret. And though the exams loomed like storm clouds on the horizon, Ruby whispered to herself each night, "Storms break, but so do skies." In the weeks leading to the exams, her tormentors grew restless. Their laughter was louder, their tricks sharper, as though sensing time was running short to break her spirit. One morning, she walked into the classroom to find her exam seat already marked. Someone had scrawled across it in chalk, "Failure reserved here." The room erupted in laughter. Ruby froze, her throat tightening. For a heartbeat, she thought she might walk out. But then she remembered her mother's words, her father's quiet sacrifices, the younger girl in the library who had whispered, "They call me names too." Ruby took a deep breath, dragged her sleeve across the chalk until the words blurred into dust, and sat down. The laughter still echoed, but the fire in her chest burned hotter. They could not mark her destiny with chalk. Even teachers seemed to doubt her. In history class, Mr. Crawley handed out practice essays, his voice dripping with doubt. "Some of you will rise to the challenge," he said, his eyes lingering on Ruby. "But others will discover they're simply not fit for these halls." The words stung, but Ruby pressed her pencil harder against the page, etching each line with steady resolve. She had stopped waiting for Crawley's approval. Her victory would not be his to give, it would be hers to claim. At home, the pressure seeped into every corner. Ruby's mother cooked late into the night, leaving plates of food by her side while she studied. Her father adjusted his work schedule, returning home early just to sit quietly nearby, his presence a silent anchor. Once, Ruby looked up from her notes to find him asleep in a chair, his head resting against the wall, exhaustion painted across his face. She closed her book softly, covering him with a blanket, and whispered into the silence, "I won't let it be for nothing, Papa. I promise." The closer the exams drew, the louder Ruby's heart beat. She was afraid, of failure, of proving her tormentors right, of letting her family down. But she also knew that fear was not the only thing inside her anymore. Alongside it now burned something stronger, the conviction that she was more than their laughter, more than their predictions, more than the chalk on her desk. She was Ruby Ellis, and she had a place in this story whether they liked it or not. The eve of the first exam arrived with a hush that seemed to settle over the entire town. The sky was painted in muted shades of gold and violet, the streets quieter than usual as families prepared their children for the great test. Ruby sat at her desk by the window, the candle burning low, her notebooks spread like a battlefield before her. She read the same passages again and again, committing each word to memory, but her mind wandered. She thought of every insult, every stolen book, every laugh that had echoed through those cruel halls. She thought of the drawing pinned to her desk, the locker smeared with chalk, the caricatures passed around. She thought of the faces of the boys and girls who had made her life into a performance for their amusement. And then she thought of the faces of her parents, weary but steadfast. She thought of the younger girl in the library, her eyes filled with hope. Ruby closed her books and pressed her hands together. "Tomorrow," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I will not break. I will not bow." She slipped the folded cruel notes and caricatures from her notebook. For months she had saved them, not out of weakness but as fuel. One by one, she unfolded them, looked at the words, and fed them into the flame of her candle. The fire licked the paper, curling the edges until they blackened and fell into ash. She watched silently, tears streaming down her cheeks. The laughter of her classmates echoed in her memory, but in the flickering firelight, it began to fade. When the last scrap had burned, she closed her notebook and rested her head on it. She did not sleep much that night, but what little rest she found was filled with dreams of standing tall, of walking into that exam hall and writing her story in ink no one could erase. And so, as dawn broke the next day, Ruby Ellis rose, her heart pounding, her steps steady. The storm had come. The test awaited. The morning of the exam dawned gray, the kind of gray that blurred edges and muffled sound, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Ruby Ellis dressed in silence. Her mother pressed the seams of her blouse with careful hands, as if smoothing away invisible wrinkles could also press out the doubts that lingered like ghosts. Her father stood by the door, hat in hand, eyes heavy but steady. When Ruby stepped out, the street felt strangely empty, though she knew beyond those quiet houses the town was buzzing. Everyone was waiting, not for the exam itself, but for her to falter. By the time she reached the school, her knees trembled, but her face remained composed. She had trained herself to walk through whispers as though they were wind. The exam hall stretched like a cathedral, tall windows casting pale shafts of light across rows of wooden desks. The air smelled of chalk dust and floor polish, but beneath that was something sharper, the metallic tang of tension. White students filled the room with crisp uniforms and sharpened pencils, laughter echoing briefly before the invigilator's gavel of silence. Ruby stepped in, and silence deepened into something colder. Dozens of eyes followed her, unblinking, measuring. Her seat was at the very back, the last desk. As always. A deliberate placement, meant to remind her where she belonged. But Ruby walked to it without pause, sliding into her chair with the calmness of ritual. She had sat in that seat every day, endured every sneer and snicker. Now, it would be the same desk where her story began to shift. The exam paper was laid face down before her, its edges sharp, its weight heavier than paper had any right to be. Ruby's hands trembled as she laid her pencil beside it. Around her, chairs scraped, pages rustled, coughs punctuated the silence. The invigilator's voice rang out. "You may begin." A rustle of paper erupted as students turned their exams over. Ruby waited 1 second longer, breathing deeply, then flipped hers. The words swam for a heartbeat before settling into clarity. Questions on history, mathematics, literature. The culmination of everything she had studied in lonely hours, every page scribbled under lamplight, every whisper memorized in secret. She pressed her pencil to the page, and the sound was like thunder in her ears, the first mark in a war she had long prepared for. Minutes bled into hours. The hall was a sea of bowed heads, the air vibrating with the steady scratching of pencils. Ruby's pencil flew across the page, her strokes sharp, deliberate. She wrote as though each word were a stone laid into the foundation of her defiance. But the distractions came. A boy 2 rows ahead twisted in his seat, glancing back with a smirk, mouthing the word failure. Another dropped his pencil deliberately, letting it roll down the aisle toward Ruby's desk. She ignored them. She had learned to live in silence, to carve out a small sanctuary in her mind where their voices could not reach. In that sanctuary, there was only the paper, the question, the answer. History was her strongest. She wrote of revolutions and resistance, of nations reshaped by courage. Her sentences carried rhythm, her words stitched together like cloth woven tight. Then came mathematics, numbers flowing like a river she had long trained herself to cross. Problem after problem dissolved under her pencil. Yet with each answer she felt eyes on her, not the watchful invigilator, but the gaze of her classmates. It was as if they expected her to stumble, to trip over a number, to prove them right. Once her hand froze. A question in geometry loomed before her like a locked gate. Panic surged, cold and suffocating. The numbers blurred, the lines twisted. Her breath came short. For a terrible moment she saw the prophecy fulfilled. She would falter, her paper would remain unfinished, and the laughter would rise like a tide. Ruby closed her eyes. In the darkness she heard her mother's voice, "Breathe, child. Calm your hands before you calm the world." She inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly. The fear loosened its grip. She opened her eyes and looked at the question again. Line by line, she broke it down, and the gate began to open. With steady hand, she completed the proof, and the pencil moved on. Time bent strangely in the hall. Sometimes it rushed like a torrent, sometimes it dragged like stone. When Ruby finally lifted her head, she saw others already leaning back, papers filled, some tapping their pencils in smug impatience. Her paper, too, was nearly covered in words and numbers, every margin filled with her determination. She checked, rechecked, whispered answers under her breath. The invigilator's voice echoed. 5 minutes remaining. A collective shiver ran through the hall. Pencils scratched faster, breaths came quicker. Ruby's hand cramped, but she pressed harder, finishing the final essay with words that burned with conviction. At last the call came. Pencils down. The silence that followed was immense, broken only by the shuffle of papers collected row by row. Ruby's hand shook as she slid her paper into the stack, the culmination of months of torment compressed into those pages. As the invigilator lifted them away, Ruby sat back, chest rising and falling. She had finished. She had endured. But whether she had triumphed, that lay in the unseen hands of judgment. The days that followed were the longest Ruby had ever lived. Each morning, the town buzzed with speculation. Parents whispered in shops, teachers exchanged knowing glances, students laughed in corridors. Rumors spread like wildfire. She failed the math section. She froze on history. She won't even rank. Ruby walked through it all with quiet steps, her face unreadable. At home, she collapsed into her chair, exhaustion flooding her bones. She had given everything, every word, every calculation, every breath of courage. Now, the weight was no longer in her hands. Her mother tried to ease her fear, cooking meals heavy with warmth, pressing Ruby's shoulders as she whispered, "You did all you could." Her father, less given to words, simply placed a calloused hand over hers at the dinner table, his silent presence saying more than sentences could. Nights were the worst. Ruby lay awake, hearing echoes of the exam hall, the scratching pencils, the ticking clock, the invigilator's stern call. She replayed questions in her mind, doubting, second-guessing. Did she remember the final formula correctly? Had her essay been too bold, too pointed in its reflections? One evening, unable to sleep, Ruby rose and stood by the window. The streets outside were still, the lamplight glowing pale. She pressed her forehead against the glass, whispering to herself, "If I fail, it will not be because I did not fight. If I succeed, it will be because I refuse to bow." She did not know yet that those pages, written in trembling but determined hands, had already begun to ripple beyond her imagination. Teachers who had dismissed her lingered longer over her answers. Administrators who expected failure paused at the sharpness of her words. Somewhere, in stacks of papers waiting for marks, Ruby Ellis had carved her place. And as she stood at the window, eyes heavy with fatigue but spirit unbroken, she knew only this: the storm had passed, the battle had been fought. All that remained was the verdict. The auditorium was dressed in banners of pride, their colors deep red and gold, draped across polished walls. Wooden floors gleamed under heavy lights, and rows upon rows of chairs filled with parents, students, and townsfolk created a restless hum. It was more than a ceremony. It was a ritual of affirmation, a moment where the school displayed its champions, paraded its brightest stars, and assured the community that its legacy of excellence remained untarnished. For Ruby Ellis, it was something else entirely. She sat near the back, once again at the edges of recognition, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her mother's hand rested gently over hers, a lifeline of warmth and steadiness. Her father sat stiffly beside them, shoulders squared as though bracing for battle. Whispers rustled through the crowd like wind over dry leaves. Will she even be here when they call the names? Will she even dare? Some parents shifted uncomfortably at her presence, as though her very sitting among them disrupted the natural order. A boy a few rows up turned to his mother and chuckled. "She won't last. You'll see." The woman gave a tight smile, her eyes locked forward. On stage, the principal, a tall man with silvered hair and a voice trained in authority, stepped to the podium. Applause rang out. His gaze swept across the room before landing deliberately away from Ruby's section, as though she were an inconvenience, a shadow in the margins. "Today," he began, "we celebrate excellence. We honor those who have upheld the proud tradition of this institution, students who represent the best and brightest of our community." Polite applause followed, though its rhythm was forced, mechanical. Ruby's chest tightened. She had sat through smaller ceremonies before, always excluded, always erased. But this was different. This was the culmination. The exam results had been tallied. The truth, whatever it was, would soon be unveiled. The principal called out the lower honors first. Top 10 achievers. Students marched across the stage, one by one, receiving certificates as the audience clapped enthusiastically. Ruby remained still, heart pounding, waiting. She saw the smirks of those who had mocked her, their self-satisfaction evident as they collected their awards. But when her name was not among them, her heart gave a sudden leap. Because the higher honors, the top 3, remained. The atmosphere thickened as the principal adjusted his spectacles, shuffling the final envelope in his hands. The hall leaned forward, breaths caught. And now, he declared, the highest recognition. The student who has achieved the first rank in our examinations this year, with distinction in multiple subjects. A pause stretched long, deliberate. Ruby felt her pulse in her throat. Every eye turned toward the stage, and in the silence, an unspoken truth rattled in the minds of many: it cannot be her. It must not be her. The principal's lips parted, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Ruby Ellis. The hall froze. For a moment, sound itself seemed stolen from the air. Then came the murmurs, the gasps, the disbelief. Some parents shifted in their seats, stunned. Others frowned deeply, their faces flushed with denial. A single clap rang from the back, Ruby's father, his palms striking together once, firm and unashamed. Her mother's tears welled instantly, her hand clasping Ruby's so tightly it trembled. Ruby sat motionless, as though the name belonged to someone else. But the spotlight turned, finding her, and there was no denying it. She rose slowly, her legs quivering but steadying with each step. The aisle stretched like a corridor of judgment, faces on either side glaring, whispering, or staring in disbelief. Yet she walked with quiet dignity, her chin lifted just enough to carry the weight of history. On the stage, the principal's handshake was stiff, his smile brittle, but the certificate he placed in her hand was undeniable. Flashbulbs popped from photographers at the edge of the hall, desperate to capture the moment that would not be erased. Ruby turned to face the audience. For the first time, she was not in the last desk, not in the back row, not hidden in shadows. She stood before them all, the banner of achievement draped across her shoulders. Scattered applause began, hesitant, reluctant. A few clapped from duty, some from genuine admiration, others from a sense of inevitability. But as the sound grew, it filled the hall. Not thunderous, not unanimous, but enough. Enough to mark the shift. Ruby's eyes swept the room, pausing on her classmates. Some looked away, others stared at her with wide eyes, as though seeing her for the first time. And in that silence between claps, Ruby knew they would never forget this day. The ceremony closed with speeches, awards, and a choir that filled the hall with songs of tradition. But for Ruby Ellis, everything blurred into insignificance. The only reality was the weight of the certificate in her hands, the feel of her mother's tears brushing her cheek, the pride radiating from her father's silent nod. Outside, the air was cool and sharp, the crowd dispersing in clusters of murmurs. Reporters scribbled notes, their eyes darting to Ruby as though unsure how to frame her story. Some parents pulled their children close, whispering warnings, as if Ruby's success were a contagion to be avoided. Others simply watched her go, their certainty cracked. At home, that night, Ruby placed the certificate on the kitchen table. Her family gathered around it like worshippers before an altar. The paper gleamed under the lamplight, its ink a declaration that could not be erased. Her father finally spoke. They will not say it out loud, but tonight, the story of this town has changed. Her mother added softly. And years from now, when others sit in those classrooms, they'll remember you. You made space where they tried to deny it. Ruby listened, silent, her heart heavy with exhaustion but lightened with triumph. She thought of the long walks to school under jeers, the weight of eyes in the hallways, the endless nights bent over books while the town slept. All of it had led here, not just to a certificate, but to a legacy. The next day, whispers continued. Some claimed favoritism, others downplayed her score, a few even denied it altogether. But the truth lived in ink, in records that would outlast denial. And among the younger black children of the town, something new bloomed: hope. They whispered her name in doorways and playgrounds, their eyes bright with the knowledge that the last desk was no longer a prison, it could be a throne. Years later, the desk itself remained in that school, scarred by decades of hands that had rested upon it. But when alumni spoke of it, they spoke of Ruby Ellis, the girl who had been forced to its back corner, and had risen to the front of history. Her story was not only her own. It was the story of endurance, of resistance, of triumph against the machinery of prejudice. The last desk had become a symbol. And Ruby, though she moved on to new battles, carried it within her forever. And so, as history turned its pages, The whispers of that day echoed still. Ruby Ellis. First rank. Against them all. The last desk was never just a piece of furniture. It was a symbol of where society tried to keep Ruby Ellis, at the margins, unseen, unheard. But when the final ceremony came, and her name was called as the highest achiever, that desk no longer held her back. It became the place she had risen from, the scarred wood that bore witness to her quiet defiance. Ruby's story reminds us that racism does not always shout from the rooftops. Sometimes it hides in the seating charts, in the lowered voices, in the coldness of a classroom where children learn not only from books but from the prejudices of their parents. And yet, against that tide, a single life can bend history. The desk is still there, in memory if not in wood, not as a mark of shame, but as a monument of strength. It whispers to every child who sits in the back of the room today, you are not forgotten, you are not less, and your brilliance cannot be erased. This was the last desk. A story of struggle, endurance, and triumph. If you believe in keeping these voices alive, subscribe to Blackness Hour. Because these are not just stories from the past, they are echoes that shape the future.